So, with lots of excitement, let us begin. So this whole event has started by an interest to learn about the insights and wisdom that Bert Hellinger has brought to us around war, collective trauma, and the darker aspects of the human conditions. The insights and wisdom you, Anngwyn, as a student and a colleague of his, have a lot to share with us beyond what is written and said in the public. Yeah. So maybe a first question would be, where and how did you meet Bert Hellinger? And how did this encounter influence your understanding and treatment of trauma?
Well, I knew about Bert Hellinger during the 1990s because I was teaching in Germany. And what I heard about him was not something that I thought would interest me at all. From what I understood, the students were describing some uptight old priest who was putting everything in order. And I thought, oh no. I'm working with trauma and chaos, and no. But then, in 1997, Bert Hellinger came for his first trip to the United States in Boulder, Colorado, where I was living and working. And I thought, well, since he's here, I'll go have a look and see what it is that's so fascinating about this Bert Hellinger. So at that time, he was not well known in the United States. So it was a very small gathering, maybe 20, 25 people at the most. Most people there were German because they knew who he was. And I don't know what I expected, but I was sitting there, and this sweet old man came and sat down, and he had Hunter Beaumont with him to translate, as Bert was not so sure about his English then. And he sat down and he said, okay, who wants to work? I thought, what? No PowerPoint, no introduction, no overview, no reading list, no maps, no graphs, no charts. No. Simple. Who wants to work? So, of course, all the Germans, they wanted to work. And so Bert set some people up, and they all started shaking. And I was looking at these shaking Germans, and the other people in the room acted as if this was something normal. And Bert was very calm, and he said, well, it's clear there's been a murder. I thought, a murder? I don't see a murder. What's going on? Been very strange. And then I realized he'd set up I was so excited to tell him You have the missing piece for trauma work.
Что
And he said, and you have the missing piece for constellation work. That was our first conversation. And he, at that time, was in a phase of intense inquiry and exploration. And he was then planning to do some pilot projects. And one of them was in a British prison
один из
because he wanted to study perpetrator victim dynamics. And he invited me to
разобраться с
come with him
жертвами преступления, с
for that
динамикой
project.
жертв
And
преступления.
I asked if I could bring my translator and assistant at the time, Karen Derma. He said, oh, yes, she can come. So that was the beginning of a very
Таким образом,
in-depth exchange about
начался очень глубокий обмен.
trauma. And trauma necessarily involves the darker aspects of the human condition. And our conversations were tended to be mostly on the darker side of life.
I could actually freeze when you spoke about the murder and everybody trembling. And I was looking, should I turn the heat on? But I know how it goes, so I waited, and I'm warm again. Thank you. And I have dogs barking outside, so I apologize.
Well, they're excited too. You know? Yeah. Dogs pick up energy.
Yes. Well, this entire event came into being and because I was looking into this collective trauma of war and as, well, not opposed, but not exact as the personal experience of war. And I was asking something about it in some Facebook group, and you were so kind to offer to give a talk about it, and I'm very glad for that. Can you share with us what are Hellinger views or understanding about this personal versus and collective aspects of war, of the generational trauma of war?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah. For him, the personal and the collective were never separate, particularly on the subject of war. At one point, he said, all wars are the wars of the gods. And these gods have different names. And these gods were called democracy, National Socialism, Communism, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and so forth. And he said, all of these gods demand sacrifice. And, you know, that's not what I learned in history class. This was a very different view of all wars, a war of the gods. Many places later in Hellinger's lectures, he talked about war as being one of the greater forces, and this is really key concept that gets kind of overlooked in his work, where people think of him as a family therapist, and he was so much more than that. And he said many times that the importance of the greater forces in war was one of these greater forces that shape individual lives, relationships, family, and other larger systems. And how many therapists ever ask a client, was anybody in your family ever in a war? Nobody ever asked me that. And that my whole life has been about war. I was born in the middle of World War II. So these greater forces, according to Hellinger, were war, famine, epidemics, religion, social unrest, natural disasters, economic collapse, and emigration. And he didn't mention radiation as such, as part of the greater forces, but in his work with individuals and families, the quote bomb was very prominent in his view of what shaped certain systems. He didn't see war as, he didn't talk about it in terms of good and evil. He basically, he saw war as a catalyst for change. And the Dalai Lama said something similar about the Chinese invasion of Tibet. Basically, he was looking at it systemically, as Bert tended to look at things systemically. When a system becomes too tight, too rigid, too fixated, an opposing force, it attracts an opposing force, which will bring about a loosening of that fixation. So, seeing war as a catalyst, as a historian, obviously, it always has been, even in the Judeo-Christian tradition, it goes all the way back to Cain killing Abel. There's always been some form of war within our species on this planet.
Yes. Funny, the Judo-Christian.
Mm-hmm. And the way that Bert worked with war in Constellation was counterintuitive and stunning for me, coming from very different paradigms, that he would set up war as an archetype. So when I saw him work, war was an archetype, and war didn't have a personality, and war didn't speak. If war started to act like a person with messages and speaking and all that, he would stop it. And he would say, who does this sound like? Or who? And he would sometimes say, no, this isn't war. This is your grandfather or whoever. And then he would put in someone else for war. And war, I hadn't seen archetypes in constellation work before. And the archetype of war was used by Bert as a source of strength and power. And I found this stunning. And now I've worked in many wars, and every time I've used war, the archetype of war, it does in fact provide a sense of strength and power. I thought this was an astonishing insight that he had. Sometimes when a family system isn't making any sense, you set it up and you just can't get what's going on. Sometimes if you introduce one of the greater forces, suddenly the whole thing takes shape. I think this was a very important observation and information for constellators, because very often we set up situations that just don't seem to make sense. And then, where are the greater forces shaping these people? It's a very important question.
Thank you. And continuing from one of the things you just said about radiation, Bert seemed to have or to bring us a very unique perspective of what it is to be family, or what does it mean, what does the concept of family means. What did it mean when he said the bomb joins the family?
Что, как вы
He
думаете,
meant exactly
он
that.
говорил, бомба
And he was talking about the family of origin, and that the bomb joins the family of origin, and it stays.
Он говорил следующее, что
down through the generations.
Бомба присоединяется к изначальной семье,
Now,
остается с этой семьей.
I found this to be true in my own work with the bomb.
Я сама работала.
I had a huge blind spot there when I first went into private practice. And a lady came in and she sat down and she burst into tears. And so I said, "What's the saddest thing in your life right now?" And she said, "My marriage." And I said, "Your marriage?" And she said, "Oh, my husband and I are fine, but we had 13 cats die of leukemia." I missed it. That was the key right there, because the issue there was radiation. What I found out much later is, after I saw Bert work with the bomb, this lady's husband was in the Navy after World War II. And the Navy issued sunglasses and a bathing suit to the soldiers who were then exposed. They were on aircraft carriers. They were exposed to the atomic testing in the South Pacific. Her father had been at Oak Ridge working on creating the bomb. Okay? You had the victim-perpetrator dynamic in the marriage. Now, this is not unusual. And it's not unusual for people to not know that when they get together. And I guess it's not unusual for the therapist to miss it by a mile. I've certainly missed it. I was watching Bert work with a lady in, I think it was in Washington, D.C. And she said, and there's a video of this. And she said, he said, what is your issue? And she said, my husband is afraid of me. And he looked at her, and she didn't look really scary, actually. He said, oh. And he said, are you dangerous? And she was like, I don't know. And he said, let's set it up. So he set up a representative for her and for her husband. And her husband started shaking. Fear. And she said, oh, by the way, my husband's Japanese. And oh, by the way, her father had a connection to the bomb. Again, these two people really didn't think about that when they got together, but his fear of her was definitely in the system. And here in the United States, we had many atomic tests, particularly in Nevada and Utah. And I worked with a very large family who had been accidentally exposed to atomic blasts, and they all had symptoms, both psychological and physical, including cancer, birth defects, and so on. And when I set up the bomb, the whole system settled down. When I was in Peru, I was working with a very nice lady she was half Japanese, she said. And I said, what is your issue? And she said, sudden explosive anger. And my mother and my grandmother had this too. So I had learned by then to suspect war for sure. Sudden explosive, when I hear that, explosive. So I said, so who came to Peru first? The grandmother. And where did she come from? And by that time I knew, I could feel it. She said Nagasaki. So we had these women who had this sudden explosive anger. So I set up the three generations of women, Nagasaki, the city, and then I put in the bomb. And all the women said, we feel peaceful. Acknowledging what is very powerful. And to look at their system without the bomb makes no sense. The bomb joins the family. I wrote, I wrote an article about that. It's published in one of my books. And that one may be in Spanish, I'm not sure.
I'm touched to tears by this family and Nagasaki and the bomb.
Yeah.
Hey.
I mean, yeah, we could take it all the way out to the human family and radiation, and we could do an extensive exploration of that. And Bert was aware of that as well.
Yes. So the next question. In 1997, as you told before, you went with Bert to this prison project in the UK, working with murderers and learning in depth the perpetrator victim dynamics, entanglement, fractals, and transgenerational implications. For me, being a second generation to the Holocaust on both sides, understanding this, learning this really made so much sense and helped me personally and professionally so much. Could you share with us what happened there and beyond just the insights? It must be a fascinating story.
Oh, there are lots of stories about that event. Mine is only one. I was, of course, very new to the work. We didn't have much in the way of written work at that time. And I think we had Love's Hidden Symmetry in English, and that was pretty much it. And suddenly, I had asked if Karen could come with me, and the event began in a British laundry. So it was this very surreal moment where we found ourselves following Bert Hellinger around a British laundry. And the prison had a laundry, and the prisoners worked in the laundry. So we moved very slowly through this laundry, and Bert was very interested in all of these processes, how the laundry got, and then how it got folded, and then he was talking to the prisoners, and it was just very surreal. Later, I realized he was not confident of his English yet. He was practicing speaking English and also tuning into the field that we were in. So he took his time in the laundry to feel the field. So we were in 3 different prisons. 2 for adults and 1 for children. So the protocol was we would work with the prisoners during the day. And then every evening we could have dinner with Bert. We could discuss what happened during the day. And we only worked with men. We only worked with convicted murderers. No women prisoners. And there were, maybe 12 of us. The numbers changed because some people came for 1 or 2 days. Between 10 and 15 of us. I was the only American. So they put me right opposite Bert for dinner. And so first dinner, we're all seated, and I sat down, and there he was, And he looked at me like, well, and he had this kind of priest-like aura about him. And there were times when I just had this feeling I had to confess. So he looked at me like, and I said, I just got my first hate mail. And he was startled. And then he smiled and he said, only one? And then I said, oh my goodness, how much hate mail must this man be getting? And here I am, I got 1 hate letter. I felt better immediately, of course, and I never got another one. So, as I watched the work, and we were in some of the constellations, it became clear that a lot of these murderers didn't know why they did it. It wasn't premeditated. And when Bert looked into their family system, they were entangled with people who had previous history of murder or victim. And he would set it all up, and that was the first time I could see a replicating fractal in a family system. It was no longer an abstraction. I mean, there it was. I could see where the entanglement was and how these people were living other people's lives, and they had no idea. So, at dinner, I said, Bert, you're working with fractals. And he said, yes, but I don't call it that. He said, let me tell you what happens when I sit together with someone. He said, you know about Russian Karelian photography, where if you have a piece of a leaf, you take a picture, and the photograph will show the whole leaf. And he said, for me, when I'm sitting with someone, it's like I have a piece of the whole picture. And this leaf, this whole leaf, is attached to a branch that's attached to a tree that belongs in a landscape in a larger setting. And he said, I don't say this. He said, this is my interior process. But he was, of course, saying he's looking at the person as the current representative of a much larger fractal, which is, of course, the system with which they are within. And there were no trainings at that time. Bert really didn't want that. And the only way to really learn from him was to follow him around. It was very much the old world medieval system of the traveling teacher, and the students would follow behind. And so that's what a group of us did for a number of years. We would follow him around. So, and we got to know each other in these various settings. So in the prison, the third day, we were in a children's prison, and somehow that seemed normal to have children. And it was an enormous facility, all these children in prison. And Bert didn't work with the children, he worked with the staff. Now, the way we got invited into this prison was Bert was a very strong advocate for body work and craniosacral work, particularly cranial work. And there have been some studies done making a connection between violent men and closed head injuries. So there was a program within the prison doing cranial work on violent men to see if this, in fact, would help them settle down. So, anyway, the lady who had invited us, toward the end of the last day, it was getting late in the afternoon, almost evening, and she wanted to work. And Bert confronted her about some shadowy things in her system that she didn't want to look at, and she she felt offended. And the long story short is she stood up and ordered us out. Right then, we got thrown out. So it's a process to leave a prison. You have to go through security, So next thing, Karen and I were standing out at freezing cold November evening, wind cold, standing there, kind of like, what happened? What just happened? And this long black limousine pulls up, and the door opens, and the voice says, "Get in." So we got in, and we were way in the back of this limo, and Bert was up front, sitting next to the driver. And then we took off. So we rode for a while, and me always with the questions. He had his back to us. So I said, "Do you think they threw us out because you're German?" Long silence. He said, "No, not because I'm German." Silence. So then we pull up to the B&B, and Bert still had his back to us. And he said in German, because Bert loved Goethe. He loved Wagner, but he loved Goethe. And he loved Faust, and he was very fond of Mephisto, and the whole character of Mephisto. And so he had his back to us, and he said in German, "Sometimes a devil must serve as the messenger of God." And that was his answer. That was the prison project. It'd be interesting to talk to others who were there for that.
Yes. A reunion of the prison team.
A prison reunion. We're all still alive.
Maybe we will arrange something. Right. So, off to more adventures. You were accompanying Bert in his first visit to Russia, to Moscow, some 20 years ago. And knowing Russian culture, and you from the USA and Bert from Germany, it must have been quite an adventure. Can you share with us what happened there?
Yes, and some of the same people who were in the prison project were with us in Russia as well, for more adventures. Bert had asked me to come because he knew I had been working in Russia. I began working in Russia, war trauma, there in 1992. I was, of course, very excited that he was coming to Moscow. And we would have, as you now mentioned, a kind of reunion of the people who had been in the prison project. And it was a very activating year. It was 2001. And I arrived in Zurich on September 11th. And that was quite a shock, as you can imagine. and I was there to teach. I was with Bertolt all summer. We were going to offer a workshop on men, women, and war, and the war between men and women. And so Bertolt and I started the workshop, and on the last day, we went for lunch, and as we were coming back, the organizer met us, and he said, there's been a shooting that the city council, a gunman had shot the city council in Switzerland in a nearby town, and that the group needed to be told. And of course, neither of us were Swiss. I was still reeling from the events in New York and Washington. And since we weren't Swiss, our organizer was our translator, and he was well known to the group, and we decided to let him tell the group, and then we managed to settle down. But by that time, and then Bertolt and I flew from Zurich to Moscow for Bert's event. And by that time, I was having quite a cumulative activation from September 11th and then the shooting in Switzerland. And we were staying in a apparently German hotel in Moscow. It was a huge, cavernous hotel. And I was still carrying a lot of uncertainty, and I went to the information desk, which, at that time I should have known better. In those days, if you want information in Russia, that would be the last place you would go. So I said I need information, and I need to know where Bert Hellinger is. And they said, we have no information. And I said, but you're the information. Yes, but we have no information. I thought, that's right, I'm in Russia. Okay. The way you get information in this culture is you ask people. So I went out into the lobby and I just started asking people. And that works, because people know. And they told me where Bert was going to present. And my Russian colleagues, I had asked Bert if I could I invite them? And he said, oh, yes, they can come. They were already there. So I was not very settled, to say the least, when I got there. And there was this huge guard in front of the door would not let me in, or my colleagues. He was... And at that point, it was just too much. It was just too much. So I just said, Bert Hellinger, Bert Hellinger, Bert Hellinger. And Bert came. And he was very calm. And he just waved the guard away. And my friends came in. And he looked at me, and he could see what a state I was in at that point. And I just wanted to tell him, September 11 and shooting, and I didn't know where you were. And he could see all that, and I didn't have to say anything. He could just see it. And he said, and then he put his arms around me, and he put my head on his shoulder. And he said, yes, you miss your father. And of course, that was the essence of it exactly. Of course, my father died in World War II. I have no memory of father. So when the world is too much, you miss your father. Just essence. Just, he knew precisely. And then I calmed down, and we could go to the auditorium. Now the organizers put the traveling troupe way in the back. And the day before, we had gone to the University of Moscow. And Bert wanted to address the young psychology students. It was a big old amphitheater. And he spoke to them, and he invited them to his event. And quite a few of them came. And then we were, way in the back, and my Russian colleagues were sitting with me like this, just. So I said, well, what's wrong? And they said, this is something shameful. I said, what's shameful? And he said, there are all these Russian people up on the stage acting like Americans. And I said, well, actually, they're acting like Germans. But what he meant was, in Russian culture at that time, it was not okay to talk about intimate family matters in a public forum like that. However, Bert had addressed the young people, and he planted the seeds there, and the work took off from that time. Later, Bert wanted to meet Peter Levine, and he spent 5 days with us in Switzerland. And we had many conversations, and one of them was about how shocked he was at finding so many abortions in Russian family systems. And of course, I knew about this because I'd been working there. And, they really had no access to contraception. Were very awkward. Not much in the way of sex education and so forth. Anyway, the time with Peter and Bert was very fruitful. We had a little round table by a bay window looking out toward Lake Lucerne, and the topic was really in which way is somatic experiencing trauma work compatible with constellation work, and where is it not? And one of the sticking points was really about handling resistance. And there had been many stories that people had been re-traumatized doing constellation work, and the trauma people were very concerned about people being re-traumatized. And Bert was very open about this, and he said, you need to understand that I came to my work through psychoanalysis. And he said, in psychoanalysis, you confront the resistance. And Peter said, in trauma work, you don't. In trauma work, we see the resistance as information. Information about how and why the client is not ready to dive into the pain, And so we build resources. So Bert thought that was very interesting, and during that event, he had many of his people there. He told them that he wanted his facilitators to study trauma work. And many of the German and Swiss facilitators actually did. And to this day, many facilitators have had some trauma training, which is necessary because, as I saw the first constellation Bert was doing, there was a murder. I mean, if you're doing a systemic constellation work, chances are you're working with trauma. So it's really important to not re-traumatize people. And I think this blind spot early in the work was really what motivated Bert to bring me into the constellation community.
Thank you for this part as well. It is really fascinating to see how younger generations, and myself included, we learned about constellations and trauma work in a way together. But it was not always like that.
No, not at all. Yeah. Not at all, no. And Peter was not wanting to mix the brands in any way. And we stayed close friends and colleagues, but we did very little in public together because of this branding. However, there exist 3 DVDs in English with German translation that Peter and I did in Zurich in 2016, where Peter's doing SE and I'm doing constellation work, and we're working together. And in these DVDs, you can see where the work really complements and where it really doesn't. You can really see both. It's very valuable, I think, information. And, we'll do something else probably soon. But I understand about keeping methods separate, but I think it's very useful for people who want to work with trauma to understand that trauma, there's no such thing as individual trauma. Trauma affects everyone that individual is in relationship to, and that's a fact. So, I think both are very important.
И при этом я считаю, что и тот подход.
I wholeheartedly agree. So for the last question of the first part, war seems to bring out the best and the worst in us human beings. Systematically, as you said before, it is a very powerful force which is considered by many to be evil. Now, Bert was an ex-priest and a theologian, and I'm wondering if you had conversations about the nature of good and evil.
Oh, yes. Many. Evil was one of his favorite topics. And anyone who intends to seriously engage with trauma work is going to encounter the darker aspects of the human nature. And if you don't want to burn out real fast, you need to get very clear about your own understanding of your relationship to what
И
you
если
understand
ты начинаешь
as
выгореть как
evil.
свечка, то тебе стоит
And that
разобраться
can be a
как можно
process,
быстрее со своим собственным
and it can
отношением
take
к
many
этому.
years.
И
And
этот
as
процесс,
a historian, you know, the ideas about
я
evil
историк,
have totally changed, keep shape-shifting. Over time, you know, the
я
church thought the printing press was evil.
могу увидеть, могу сказать,
And
что
so on and so
мнения
on.
Гитлера развивались со
There was a
временем.
wonderful
А,
cultural
Во многом
historian,
определили
William
время
Irwin
и считается
Thompson.
большим злом.
And he said, the future announces itself as evil.
И цитата, которую
And I thought,
опять
that's
Берт
profound. I
Hellinger, что
sit with that.
будущее
I think,
декларирует себя как зло.
if that's true, what are we thinking about now?
А будущее проявляет
And
себя
I
как
think,
зло.
yeah, many people think AI is evil. Anyway, I had all these good ideas about relative evil. Over history, things that were considered evil, now we don't consider evil, like printing press.
Когда-то считали злом, а потом не считаем злом. И также многие не.
And so I was sharing this with Bert over breakfast.
За ужином я поделилась.
Because we had been talking about ghosts. That was another
Тогда мы говорили
supernatural conversations.
о
And
наших бесед.
ghosts and hauntings and
призраки.
so I said, well, now I'm seeing there's something like relative evil, which is in the perception of the culture, and absolute evil. And Bert was quiet, and then he said, Anngwyn, there is no absolute evil. Now, I'm still sitting with that. And we had these breakfasts where it was just the two of us because Peter liked to sleep in. So, and Bert was an early riser and me too. So I had him to myself, usually during breakfast. And maybe I should tell you that the first of these breakfasts, I had the sense again, you know, he was sitting there buttering his toast, just enjoying his coffee, and I was feeling terribly guilty. And I realized I was just not going to get out of it. And I thought, well, here's my chance to ease my conscience. So I told him I was living in a little ghost town in Arizona, and the people on my side of the hill had a lot of disturbance from a ghost they called the fire starter. And I read in the paper there were these ladies who were going around looking for haunted houses, and they were writing a book, and I invited them to come stay. I said, I live in a haunted house. You can stay here and spend the night, and they did. And of course, you know, they had all this equipment for photographing auras and herbs. So in the morning, they reported, yes, of course, you know, the usual phenomena. And they wanted to do some kind of ceremony to get rid of this fire starter ghost, because he was the one that was really causing the problems. And I said, oh, well, you want to try something different? And they said, really? Yeah. I said, okay. So basically what I did is I did a constellation for the ghost, and the ghost set up a representative for them. The ghost came right away and was very clear that he was abandoned as a little boy by his parents, and his grandmother took care of him, and she didn't like little boys. And she used to hold his hand over a fire in the kitchen to punish him. And then he said he died in a knife fight as a teenager. So, I did what any facilitator would do in that situation. And then he said, I'm really sleepy now. I'm very tired. I need to go to sleep. And he went to sleep. But then I thought, oh my God, what would Bert Hellinger think if he knew that I had been constellating a ghost or a deer? So anyway, I told him what I did. And he was still buttering his toes, and he really didn't react. And he said, well, Anngwyn, the principles are the same if your client is alive or dead. And I thought, oh. And then after a while he said he lived in a haunted house. I said, you do? What do you do when they come? He said, I tell them to just turn around and look at something greater and to go there. And I said, do they? He said, oh, yes. And that was the end of that conversation.
Illuminating in so many ways.
Alive or dead, it doesn't matter.
Yes. This distinction between life and death is really challenging constellations, isn't it?
Yes. And I have found later generations of constellators are really quite rigid in their rule making, and Bert himself was so spacious. He was very spacious, always open to a surprise, to something new, to something he'd never seen before, something he had fun. This wonderful spaciousness that sort of, I think, got a little bit lost in the later iterations of the work.
Every generation invents their own. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, there's this whole thing, about doing it right. Bert didn't have that.
Yeah.
He was in tune with the field and the client in the moment. And it wasn't about doing it right. It was always inquiry.
There is a reason why I was the first and we follow. Okay, thank you for all of this and beautiful and amazing stories and experiences. We will now have a short 7 minutes break, just to have some, get fresh, move our body, drink, with the toilets. We'll meet here again in 7 minutes for the next section, which will be questions and answers, and I will explain how this will work after the break. So see you all in 7 minutes. Thank you. So, in this stage, you will have the option to ask Anngwyn through myself some questions. The questions that we are inviting here are questions about Bert Hellinger, about what Anngwyn learned from him and with him. So we continue the idea of learning from the wisdom and the insights of Bert Hellinger. So here's a question. How did Bert Hellinger view collective trauma in relation to large groups affected by war, racism, etc.?
He saw war as integral to the human condition. So, if he saw war, the way it affected the individual, the way it affected relationships, the way it affected family systems, whole cultures, whole countries. He paid very close attention to current events and would speculate about what the systemic implications of something might be. And I remember when we were in Windsor, not long after the death of Princess Diana, he had some observations to say from a systemic point of view. So he never really saw war as something separate from the human condition. It was integral for him. And, when Bert was talking about war, he wasn't only talking about shooting wars. When he was talking about War of the Gods, he was talking about and thinking in terms of, there's shooting wars, and their culture war, class war, their religious wars, civil wars, and genocide is also war on a particular segment of the population. So war is more than just guns and armies and things like that.
Thank you. There's a question close to my heart. Did Bert ever mention anything about witch trials?
Yes. Yes. He did, and that he felt in a certain time and place, other time and place, that he would have been burned at the stake for sure. He saw it as a collective hysteria and projection of woman as evil, which goes all the way back to blaming Eve for tempting Adam with the apple. And had a lot to do with sexual hysteria and fear of sexuality, but also Bert was well aware that not only women were burned as witches, but men were accused and burned, hung, drowned, whatever the local culture practice was. And this was, of course, a huge topic in Switzerland and Germany because of the enormous number of persecutions that happened there against so-called witches, some of whom were actually practicing witchcraft, and others were nice old ladies who had a herb garden and a cat. But he was very aware of the phenomena on many, many levels, historical, spiritual, and so on.
Thank you.
And he was also very clear about the consequences for the perpetrators who denounced the witches and who judged them and who killed them. And those that were complicit, there were transgenerational consequences for this. And I believe he was quite right about that.
You say something about these consequences?
Oh, I saw them myself when I was working in Switzerland. Lady came in and she was depressed, and she said that her mother had gone down into the basement, poured gasoline over herself, Now, this is not a Swiss suicide. The Swiss put rocks in their pockets and they go into the lake, or they jump under the train. But self-immolation, no. That's, when we hear about suicide, it's very important exactly how did the person do it, because that's a clue. So I had the idea that the client's mother was entangled with a witch burning. And Switzerland burned almost more witches than anybody else on the continent. And they kept impeccable records of exactly who denounced, who was the judge, and what happened to the accused. It's online. So my theory was that the woman had been entangled with a witch. So anyway, my client did the research, and in fact, her family system was descended from the person who denounced the witch, who was burned. Okay, so it's a question of balance. It's not fair, but it is about a system needing to, Bert talking about this consequences as the archaic level of balance, and the perpetrator, the consequences for the denouncing the witch came generations later. It's not fair, but it is balance, archaic balance. I had problems with this, that innocent people should pay for this. But he said, I complained. This isn't fair. The innocent people should die horrible deaths because of something somebody did. And he said, it's cruel, actually. That's the archaic level of balance. And you see a lot of that in Switzerland because of the enormous number of people who were killed.
Yes, a lot to handle in the body. I got a bunch of questions here. Let's see what feels good for us all. There's a question here that Bert said that for the reconciliation to occur, the perpetrator needs to look at the victims and acknowledge the damage. How can wounds heal when this doesn't happen? There is an example in the Armenian genocide today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with and the consequences of lack of resolution of that genocide is ongoing, particularly due to the denial that it happened, denial that there were that many victims, denial, on and on and on. And it's not unusual in human history for people to want to deny genocide, whether it's the Armenians, the Native Americans, the Jews, what happened in Rwanda, what's going on now in China. This is human nature, unfortunately, and the denial keeps the situation ongoing, and it is far from resolution. I was in a constellation about that genocide that Albert Moore did, and I was representing a Turkish soldier, and I looked at all these bodies. Well, too bad, it had to happen. Okay, a lot of people feel that way. It had to happen for whatever reason. Many in this country feel like what happened to the Native Americans had to happen. Had to happen is the cover-up. And there is remorse, lack of remorse. Sometimes remorse doesn't come for many generations. Unfortunately.
Yeah, so there is a question about did Bert share with you his experience as someone who was in war, who was and we have some.
Yes,
someone
he did.
Muted here. Thank you.
Yes, he did. It was during the prison project. We would often chat on the breaks, and he asked me what I knew about torture and what I knew about torture, how we worked with torture, and he was especially interested in electrical torture. And I told him what Peter and I had worked with. And at that time, Peter wrote an article about how to work with the nervous system when there's been electrical torture. And that particular article seems to have gone into a black hole somewhere. But Bert was very interested, and that's when he said he wanted to meet Peter. Then he told me that during the war, toward the end of the war, he was drafted into the Wehrmacht, which was the regular German army. He was 14. And he was sent to Calais, where the Germans were expecting the Allies to cross the Channel at the shortest distance, which would have been Calais. So they were expecting the Allies' invasion to come there. And he said the Germans' forces were in these chalk tunnels, and there was no light in the tunnels. So they strung electrical wire along the ceiling of these miles and miles of chalk tunnels. And he said at one point, remember, he's 14, he unscrewed one of the light bulbs and he stuck his finger in. He said, just to feel something. 14. He was then, of course, the Allies didn't come in at Calais. They came in at Oklahoma and Utah Beach. Anyway, he was subsequently captured by the Allies, and he was a prisoner of war of the British. And he said that he was so well treated by the British that he wanted to work in a British prison to give something back.
No. He did.
He did.
Yeah. A different direction. Question: did Bert ever speak about transgender people and the LGBTQ community in general from a systemic point of view?
No.
No.
We had discussions, reluctant discussions, because this was not Bert's favorite topic. I wanted his view on some of the newer reproductive technologies, such as in vitro, and what is the fate of the embryos who remain frozen, and now, you can, babies can have 3 parents, there could be an egg donated, and then another person's DNA could be in that egg, and then there's a sperm, and then, this person can biologically have 3 parents, and I was, and, clones, and he said, stop, you're making me dizzy. But then he would think about it. And he said, everyone who contributes to the life of the child must be acknowledged and included. He said it was his view, if there was a conception that counts as a sibling or as a child. And this is very complicated because some couples have 15 of these frozen. What's the impact of this on the couple, on the siblings? Do they have survival guilt? What about birth order? These are a lot of the questions. And what about clones? And he really did not like to explore that territory, but he did think about it. And the whole gender thing has really is related in many ways to the bomb, to radiation, and the effect on human DNA. So we're going to see more and more of that. And that's another topic, but it was not his favorite topic, but he did think about it. And I think he would find it deeply troubling. But that's speculation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And there is a question here about deep poverty as one of the big forces about a war between those who have and those who don't have. And was there a concern for Bert to offer something for those in deep poverty, I don't know, the community level, or thought of how Constellation should be available?
Well, deep poverty, would be under the rubric of economic collapse and class war. I had a rather shocking conversation with him one morning in Switzerland. One of his organizers from China was there, and at breakfast, and he said, "You should go to China." And I said, "Oh, I would like to do that." But I knew Bert had been to China, and I thought I knew his position on abortion, and I wondered what his position was, his feelings were about the one-child policy in China. Because in China, for sure, there is deep poverty, and not only China, but so I asked him. Because the one-child policy means basically that the girls are killed if they're born, or they're adopted out, or they're dumped in the trash, or aborted, because, the culture wants boys. So he said his view was that this was a child by the collective to ensure the survival of the many. So I'm still sitting with that. I never heard him use the word poverty as such. Not that he didn't. It just, it was not part of our conversation, but he felt like with China, they had too many people and they couldn't feed them all.
Another load of heaviness. Yes. There is a bunch. I'm sorry.
You did ask.
I did ask.
You did ask.
I will bear the consequences of the asking. There is a bunch of questions here related to constellations, not on the past, but on something that is recent. So recent natural disasters or the COVID situation, different questions around that theme. And the question asked from it is, how did Bert relate to things which are not in the intergenerational consequences that will happen one day to the children of the children? Or how did he work with constellations around things, recent trauma, this day trauma? Did he work with that?
I'm thinking. He definitely worked with the Holocaust. He, in my experience, remember, I wasn't always with him. He would enter into the collective very often through the dynamic of perpetrator-victim. I do not recall him doing anything with natural disasters. It'd be interesting to hear his take on the COVID agenda, what he thinks is really going on. But that's not possible. And of course, somebody could set up his representative and ask. It's always an option.
There's a theoretical debate here. Who would be speaking?
Be interesting. That's right. Yeah.
Another question is, are genocides a necessity in the evolution of humanity? Because you said that war is necessity, it is integral, but are genocides as well?
That's a theological as well as historical question. I don't know if it's necessary. It's certainly integral. And there have been cycles of history where whole races of people have given way to other races. For example, the Neanderthals disappeared so that we can be the dominant hominid. And it looks like there were several other versions of hominid which were eliminated one way or another to make way for Homo sapiens sapiens. So was that necessary? I don't know. Was it likely? Yeah. I don't think they all fell off a cliff. I don't believe that. You know, they say, oh, the Neanderthals disappeared. No, they didn't. We killed them. Probably. And I think we also intermarried with some of the earlier versions of us. Was this necessary? I don't know. But it contributes. I know I myself have Neanderthal genes. I'm happy about that. I need their strength. It seems to be that humans are territorial and that we have somewhere within us a need to eliminate competition for resources. And if the competition can be identified by physical characteristics, that makes it easier to identify them so that we can survive. And the more we know about human history now, we know about how many other versions of us there were in history now, we know. And they were probably genocided. I don't know, I wasn't there, but genocide really comes from a belief in us and them, and whoever they are is somehow threatening us through contaminating our gene pool or bringing us diseases or taking away our children or stealing our gold, whatever, you know, they want to live on our mountain. And it's human history. You hear it today. You know, we hear about all the refugees that are bringing disease. You know, it's same old, you know. Hitler did that under the Third Reich. You know, we had to get rid of the Jews and the Gypsies and the gays because, you know, they were polluting the culture. And people believe that. And it's not much different today, actually.
Yes. Sorry to say. Sorry to agree. Yeah. Going back to ghosts, maybe, there was a question about, did Bert talk about reincarnation and past lives as opposed to intergenerational transfer?
Yes, he did. And his thinking changed. When I first met him, his position was that people who were having past life memories they were really ancestral memories. That was his belief. And people were saying, no, but I remember being Chinese. I remember being African. And, you know, and he was like, no. This is archetypal, you know, no. But then he changed because, as he said, his approach was phenomenological. So what that meant was he allowed the field to inform him. So, you know, even if he had an idea about what was going on, very often the field would show him something different. So the tighter his belief got about reincarnation, the more insistent the field was in showing him that reincarnation was real. And finally, he said, all right, let's have a look. So he did a seminar in Ecuador, I believe, on reincarnation. And it's my understanding that from that time forward, he considered that this past lives and reincarnation were in fact real. So, like many things, his thinking evolved as the field kept showing him that what he thought was so was not always so.
Yes, it touches on what you said about his spaciousness and about not being rigid in how it should be done. His development.
Yeah.
So the questions about talking about war again. Should we look at war, at battles, or at even genocide from both sides? For example, there is the Armenian genocide, but someone here says that the Armenians had their own share of genocides, and right now there is the great-grandfather of the writer adopted and raised an Armenian kid. She's Turkish. And we as new generations are still in touch with them as friends. Does this show that we both killed each other and then we became part of each other's systems or each other's family?
Similar with the Native Americans. Very similar.
So this takes us to the next question. Did Bert talk about colonialism trauma?
Oh, yes. Often. He also saw it as he was not an advocate of colonialism as such, but he saw it, like war, as a catalyst. Which it was and still is. And he always spoke in a more general sense about the consequences of exploitation. He said this is something very serious. I remember a session I only saw on film, although we did discuss it at breakfast. And it was a learning circle. I think it was in New York, I'm not sure, somewhere on the East Coast. And there was a very beautiful lady dressed in a blood red dress. And she was obviously angry and proud. And she had classic Inca features, like you would see on a mural. And Bert looked at her and he said, I think she stood up, actually. He said, who has an issue? It's on film, you can see it yourself. And she stood up. Who has an issue? She stood up. And he looked at her and he said, the time for your empire has passed. And she sat down. Relieved. I thought that was a very bold intervention. The time for your empire has passed. It's a very spacious view of what happened to the Incas and all other indigenous people, and also all empires. It is the nature of empires to rise and fall. And when it's time, they fall. The fall of the Roman Empire took a very long time, and, it didn't really fall when Rome fell. The Roman Empire continued on in the East, and what was then Byzantium. It was a very long process. The Soviet Empire fell almost overnight. Different.
Yes. There is a lovely question. Did Bert have an idea about how the field is evolving, in the sense that by doing this work, we all contribute in somehow helping information to spread and become more tangible to everyone, to help humanity to look beyond good and evil?
He didn't say anything that I'm aware of as specific as that, though he did make very clear that the informational field is interactive. So the more aware, the more awake and aware we become, the more information goes into the field and then comes back to us in the collective. He also had a very spacious view of humanity, and intimated on a number of occasions that this version of us did not originate on this planet, which I thought was interesting. So he was thinking beyond Earth.
It might come as quite a shock for some of us.
Why?
I can remember the first time I had this sense that if I go enough backwards, another star is there, like, oh my God.
Why would humanoids be unique to this planet? I mean, as I said, he was very spacious.
Yeah.
He didn't speculate in detail. He just had room for a lot of information to come and go.
A part of his greatness. There's a question about drugs and narcotics and systemic roots, about drug abuse and this narco traffic. I'm not sure what the term means.
He saw addiction as not the problem.
Mm-hmm.
He said addiction is the symptom of the problem. So as long as you think that the addiction is the problem, you will fail. This addiction is the symptom of the problem, which is unresolved trauma. Now, Gabor Mate says the same, Peter Levine says the same. That was Bert's view. Also, at times he would intimate that, particularly with alcohol, there was a disruption in father's line, but, he wasn't into handing out recipes or linear pronouncements. He sort of had an idea of which pond to fish in, And, our culture sees addiction as the problem, which is why the treatment programs fail.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have time for one last question. And the last question is, did Bert ever talk about the possibility of transforming to a more positive collective catalyst than war? Or are we doomed to repeat a pattern of suffering forever in order to evolve?
No, he didn't. And not, not to my knowledge, no. He was very accepting of the darker aspects of this current version of our species. When I knew him, yeah.
Yeah.
And he was, he knew ants have wars. Red ants fight with black ants. Bees have wars. They fight with the hornets. Chimpanzees have wars. Chimpanzees have clans. One day they get up and somebody grabs a club and goes and kidnaps a female from the other tribe, and then they have a war. You don't have to be human to have a war. So did he talk about transcending it? Not to my knowledge. So you should talk to some of the other people who may have heard him say something different.
Maybe we will. Who knows?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, so the question about drugs was actually about, not about abuse, but about drug criminal organizations, cartels, and the such. Like, what is the role of criminals in general, systemically speaking?
You put a lot into that sentence there. Who decides who's a criminal? Political dissidents are treated as criminals and sometimes imprisoned or killed as criminals. If you disagree with the state or the church, you're a criminal. Or, people whose lifestyle involves stealing from other people or killing people for sport or for whatever reason. The criminal doesn't quite, there's a huge spectrum of behavior that goes under criminal. So I'd be careful with that. He did talk about perpetrators. And I think if you want to understand Bert, you look for the word perpetrator rather than criminal. And there was some cartels. Cartels, yeah. They're tribes. Okay? They have tribal consciousness. And they have rules, and I worked for many years in Mexico, and there was a time when I was an art historian and I studied pre-Columbian art, and they have a marvelous National Archaeological Museum in Mexico City, and they have displays of the different Mesoamerican cultures, and in some of these cultures, public torture was sort of like the entertainment, sort of like the Romans did in the Colosseum. The Aztecs and the Mayans, and they tortured people in very, very specific ways. And then, you could see them in the museum, how they did this. And what's happening in Mexico now is the drug cartels are torturing and executing people in exactly the same way that the Aztecs and the Maya did. Now, I don't really believe that the gangs are going to the museum and taking notes. I don't think that's what's happening there. I think they have epigenetic memories of tribal practice. Some of these practices are very dark. And it's this with many tribes, that the tribes are bound together by violence, by rituals that include violence and fear of violence, also fear of exclusion. So the mafia, you've seen the film The Godfather. I mean, there were rules. And the drug cartels and, the Iranian mafia and the Russian mafia, the Serbian mafia, they all have their own family rules. Human nature. But think of them in terms, if you want to understand what's going on with them, think about tribal consciousness, good conscience and bad conscience. What do you need to do or not do in order to belong to the cartel, to the mafia, to the gang? Yeah. And there are rules. It's very clear.
Yes. So another question is, what was Bert's view about people who were the descendants of both the perpetrators and the victims, or of both sides in a war, not necessarily of each other?
Well, he said a lot over time. First of all, they're bound to be attracted. It's the Romeo and Juliet thing, the attraction of the enemy of your system. It's usually the young people who fall in love with the other side. And of course, the systems don't support the relationship, and, you get the drama from there. What he said is going on is there is a greater movement toward reconciliation, but the initial, that's what the initial attraction is in service of, although many couples cannot transcend because the systems are so opposed. And it happens a lot that anybody who does couples therapy, it's very important to ask about the ethnic and religious background of both partners. And it's very likely if they're having a conflict that their conflict has something to do with that. Although they never thought about that when they thought they were two personalities. And even when they are well aware that our systems have been in or still are in opposition, young people, they get into this intensive, wonderful word. I love this word, limerence. Limerence. They get into limerence, which is the first stage of romantic love. And it's like, we're so in love, we can transcend the German, Jewish, Romanian, Hungarian, and black, white. Mm-hmm. Now, limerence lasts from 10 minutes to 2 years, usually. And that's when the systems kick in. And then you find that you have been called into service of a possible reconciliation, which may or may not work out. In any event, for the awakened aware, it can be very enlightening, even if the relationship doesn't work.
And there's a question here about war and the interrupted movement of reaching out, I think. Yes. If Bert had something to say about that.
War and interrupted movement of reaching out, well, sure. If you think about it, what does war do to a family? What a child needs is a safe mother. And in a war zone, the mother isn't safe. So any place you have war, and in many parts of the world, every generation has had war. Just look at Russia and Germany and East Europe. It's a revolving door war, ethnic conflict, and the mother isn't safe. So what you get, and Karen Dremel is really the expert on this aspect of systemic work. Many of the essential developmental movements remain incomplete because mother wasn't available, mother was traumatized, mother was dead, mother was raped, mother was whatever. And where was father? Father was usually taken away, sent away. He couldn't protect his wife and children. And even if father comes back, he's probably traumatized and not available to the mother or to the children. And, the developmental sequences for reaching out is reaching out to who? To what? And very often, this is a lot with attachment theory, the child gives up. And there's a whole body of work about developmental aspects of war. And, very often, if you ask, was anybody in your family ever in war, people think about soldiers. No, everybody's in a war because the whole family is impacted when one family member is involved in war. Now, if you have a war, which we have had in recent history, of huge numbers of countries and populations being occupied by a hostile force, everybody's in a war, including the families of the occupiers who are home wondering what happened to their loved ones. So this impacts children even before they're born. Huge topic. I mean, a lot interrupted. Trust issues, especially.
Another theological question. Did Bert say something about the origins of the soul? Because if there are reincarnations, and there is this descendant line, did it say something about the origin of the soul?
I didn't hear him use that language.
Mm-hmm.
But, he did say on a number of occasions that we don't have a soul, but we're in a soul.
We don't have a soul, we are in a soul.
Mm-hmm. We're in a soul. And that soul is in a soul, like the Russian nested dolls, the Matryoshkas. Okay? So we're in a soul and we're in the family soul, and then we're in the species soul. He gave a talk, very, very important talk. Everybody should try to find this talk. I just recently found it. And he talked about, this was at Würzburg conference in, I think it was 2000, well, I don't know. I've forgotten which year it was, but it was a Würzburg conference. It was his final keynote address, and there were like 1,500 people there. And his address was on the Jewish soul and the Christian soul. And the fallacy of the chosen people. Basically, he was saying that in Judeo tradition, they felt themselves to be chosen, but then when the Christians came along, they said, no, God doesn't like you anymore. We're the better ones. So we're the chosen people. The Christian people, we're the chosen people. So then came the Nazis with their whole idea of the Aryan race and the destiny of the purified Ubermensch, superhuman people, and they were the chosen people, and everyone who was not of this Aryan race needed to be eliminated. So he was saying that the whole notion of chosen people leads to violence, and he was talking about this on the level of the soul. So it exists in many languages. You might read it for yourself and draw your own conclusions. But this idea of being in a soul is very spacious, actually, more than just a personal thing. And maybe his last book, one of his last books that he wrote himself was called Churches and Their Gods. And he addressed some of the theological questions relating to soul and to God. And basically, from what I understood reading that is, he said it's a mystery.
Great mystery. I find myself in awe, just sensing him through you, through your words.
I was always in awe of him. And he was amused by that.
I can see that too. Okay, let's see, more questions. So there's a slightly long one, but the essence I take from it is the last part. If the evolutionary force is manifesting the trauma, could it also manifest the movement of reconciliation?
Theoretically, sure. I had an interesting experience at one point. I was in New York, and I grew up near Manhattan, and as a child, I loved going to the Museum of Natural History and seeing the dinosaurs. I loved all of them. And one of the things that drew me to Peter Levine was I heard him carrying on at a party about reptilian consciousness and dinosaur brain and evolution, and I thought, I need to meet this person. So I was in New York for an event, and I went to visit my old friends, the dinosaurs there, and I went. They had changed them around. They had different heads on them than I remember, and so on. But I was in this, and there was no one there. There's no one there. It's just me and these, dinosaurs. And I got very quiet, and I had the somatic sensation of what it was like to live on a planet where the highest level of consciousness was the reptile. And that was a long time before the mammalian brain, the universe, the field, took care of them. Was the comet evil? It destroyed this beautiful reptilian empire. I mean, you can look at it that way, but, I think if you were a dinosaur, you would have thought that was a terrible thing, to wipe out our species. But for those of us who came later, it was, oh, thank God, Then, the comet managed to wipe out most of the dinosaurs, and then the mammals had a chance to evolve, and then whether you believe we're in that chain of evolution or whether we're engineered, I mean, I don't know. But whatever happened was a progression. And we do know there were other versions of us. Is their death tragic? Is it awful? Well, we survived because they're gone, we're here. And there's no reason to believe that evolution is over. Oh yeah, that was what happened in the Jurassic period. Yes, that was evolution. No, it's ongoing. And if comet hits again, we will think it's terrible, but maybe whoever comes next will think, oh well, good, we got rid of them, and now we can have the planet to ourselves. So it's relative.
Oh, so relative.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it could happen any day. Any day. I mean, it has before. I mean, we don't know how many civilizations there were before the comet. Or after. I mean, I don't know. It's... I think it's wise to be spacious in one's musings about history.
Mm. So from an evolutionary point of view, we are the descendants of the dinosaurs.
We have a reptilian brain.
Yeah.
It's in there.
What kind of transgenerational trauma do we carry from them?
Well, the reptilian brain has few options. The reptilian brain is only concerned with survival, okay? So the options are fight, flight, freeze, and then there's another one which is fawn, which means go along, get along, do whatever you need to do to survive. It's pretty limited, not complex intellectually. Fight, flight, freeze, go along. And that's the reptilian system. It's not many options. And sometimes, you hear people referred to in a pejorative way. Oh my God, he's such a reptile. Or this reptile or that reptile. And a lot of people believe there is a reptilian species that coexists with us on this planet. So spaciousness is a good idea.
Yeah. There's a question about what were Bert's thoughts about the grief process, about the importance of grief.
He felt it was sacred. And that the inability to grieve would keep people, families, and tribes, nations stuck. And he saw the value in ritual, and particularly the arts, in grieving process.
I feel like we're reaching towards the end of this beautiful gift that you're sharing with us. And I would like to ask or invite you, if you feel that there is something that you feel like saying after all of this, not from what was asked, but what is coming to you from the field, and if there is something like that, and that you feel shouldn't be left unsaid.
Sometimes people ask me if I was sad when Bert passed. And I was, of course. But, he left us in stages. And his actual passing was not a shock or a surprise. But when he was gone, I realized what he gave me was enough. Was enough. And I could let him go. With gratitude. Was enough. So thank you.
Thank you. At the loss of words to express my thank you. That it is great.